The glass-walled boardroom gleamed under cold light. Men in tailored suits occupied every chair, voices pressing against one another in urgent, clipped tones. No one noticed the man in the worn button-down standing quietly near the back wall. He had been summoned as a temp, a pair of hands to check cables. Then the door swung open. A boy of 6 burst through, eyes red-rimmed and glistening, scanning the room until they locked on the quiet man in the corner. "Why didn't you come back?" Every voice fell silent. And the most powerful woman in that room stood, frozen, speechless. Lucas Carter was 27 years old, and he had learned to make himself small, not in the way of defeated men who have given up on space, but in the precise, deliberate way of someone who has decided that being overlooked is sometimes a form of protection. He drove a 10-year-old sedan with a cracked dashboard and a bobblehead of a cartoon dog on the console that his daughter, Mia, had placed there 3 years ago and declared immovable. He owned 4 dress shirts, 2 of which were still presentable. He had not slept more than 5 consecutive hours in 2 years. Mia Carter was 6 years old. She had her father's steady brown eyes and her late mother's wild dark curls, and she had inherited from neither of them an ability to stay still. She was the loudest, most insistent part of Lucas's world. The alarm he set himself. The reason he packed 2 sandwiches every morning instead of 1. The reason he took every contract job that came through the temp agency, even when they paid barely enough to cover the difference between rent and groceries. He did not complain. He cataloged every system he touched, every office building he passed through. He cataloged with the silent, methodical attention of someone who had once been paid handsomely to do exactly that and no longer was. He had left that world behind 5 years ago, or rather, it had pushed him out, and he had decided not to push back. That was a chapter he had closed. Or tried to. Evelyn Hayes was 28 years old, and she had learned to make herself large. She had not always been this way. There were photographs from her early 20s where she looked tentative at podiums, shoulders slightly raised, hands folded too neatly in front of her. No one at Hayes Technology Group would recognize that woman. The Evelyn Hayes, who now sat at the head of conference tables, the one whose silence could stop a room faster than anyone else's voice, had been built deliberately, layer by layer, over nearly a decade of proving herself in boardrooms where she had always been the youngest and usually the only woman. She ran Hayes Technology Group, a mid-sized data infrastructure firm with contracts across 5 industry verticals. She did it without visible sentimentality, without public displays of uncertainty, and almost entirely without rest. She had a son named Noah. She did not speak about Noah in professional settings. Noah Hayes was also 6 years old. He was quiet in a way that worried the adults around him, not withdrawn exactly, but careful, as though he had learned early that words could be taken away, and so he chose them sparingly. His teachers liked him. Other children found him difficult to read. He had not warmed easily to anyone in years, which was something his mother's housekeeper noted in careful, indirect language, and his mother noted in silence, at night, in the privacy of her own thoughts. He had once warmed completely and immediately to a man with steady brown eyes who had brought his daughter along on a Saturday errand and let both children pick their own ice cream flavors without parental commentary. That had been 2 years ago. Noah still thought about it. He had never understood why that man disappeared. The crisis that brought Lucas Carter into the building on a Tuesday morning in early November had been simmering for weeks. Hayes Technology Group's primary data management platform, the architecture that governed routing, storage, and security for 32 enterprise clients, had begun producing what the internal team described as anomalous behavior, latency spikes, corrupted query returns. 3 clients had filed formal complaints in the past 10 days. The temp agency had been called. Lucas had been sent. The elevator opened onto the 14th floor, and a woman at the reception desk handed Lucas a badge without looking up. Visitor Temporary Technical Support. The badge was red. Every other person he passed wore blue. Ryan Mitchell noticed the red badge, before he noticed anything else. Ryan was the director of engineering at Hayes Technology, 34 years old, and meticulous about hierarchy in the way that men who feel insecure in their own expertise often are. He had been with the company for 3 years, had overseen 2 platform upgrades, and had built a small army of deference around himself by being consistently intimidating to anyone below his pay grade. He was not technically incompetent, but he was the kind of engineer who understood systems as they had been explained to him, not as they actually worked. He looked at Lucas Carter the way someone looks at a delivery that has arrived in the wrong box. "You're from the agency?" "Yes." "You do cable management? Basic hardware checks?" "Yes." Ryan nodded once, with the particular economy of a man who has already decided this conversation is beneath him. He handed Lucas a printed list. "Physical checks. Server room B. 3rd cabinet from the left. Reconnect any loose Ethernet runs. Log it on the paper form, not the digital system." The digital system, Ryan explained with a pointed look, was for actual engineers. Lucas took the list without comment. He spent the first 2 hours in server room B. It was a long, humming space, with the low-grade roar of cooling systems and the greenish glow of indicator lights stacked floor to ceiling. He moved methodically through the cabinet checks, labeling and logging, his handwriting small and even. He was not thinking about the job. He was thinking about Mia's school pickup at 3:15, about whether the transmission shudder in the sedan was getting worse, about the grocery list he had memorized that morning. Then he glanced at the monitoring terminal, mounted at the end of the row, a diagnostic display that was technically not his to touch, and stopped. The numbers on the screen were not right. He stood there for a long moment, not moving, hands loosely at his sides. The display was showing aggregate query load across the primary routing layer. The distribution pattern was wrong, skewed toward a single node cluster, in a way that should have been flagged by the automated alert system. He traced the logic backward in his head, in the time it might take another person to read a short paragraph. He recognized the architecture. Not just recognized, he knew it the way you know handwriting you spent years producing. The routing schema, the node naming convention, the particular logic of the security layer. He had written it, not a version of it, not something similar. He had written this 5 years ago, in a different room, when he had been a different kind of person at this company. He pulled his hands back from the terminal without touching it. He finished his cable checks. He logged them on the paper form. He replaced his tools in the bag and walked back to the main floor, where an assistant named Carla gave him a cup of terrible coffee and a seat near the wall, and told him someone would be with him shortly. No one was with him shortly. He watched 2 senior engineers argue over a secondary log file that he could already see was a symptom, not a cause. He watched Ryan Mitchell circle a whiteboard with an expression of controlled authority and draw an architecture diagram that was partially wrong. He watched Evelyn Hayes pass through the room at 11:14 without looking at him or anyone below managerial level. A woman in motion, all compressed focus and quiet velocity. He said nothing. He was, after all, just a temp. The code was there on the 3rd floor, on a screen someone had left running. Lucas had been sent up to check a projector connection, another low-tier errand, another reason to be invisible on an upper floor. He connected the cable, tested the display, and was about to leave when the presentation on the screen resolved into something that stopped him completely. It was a legacy architecture diagram. Someone had pulled it for reference during the ongoing crisis analysis. It showed the original routing framework for the Hayes platform, dated 4 years and 8 months prior, and in the lower right corner there was a small annotation in the code comments. A habit Lucas had developed in his first job, a kind of signature he'd never been able to fully stop. A dash, a space, and then 2 lowercase letters, his initials. He stood in the empty conference room for longer than he needed to. The projector hummed softly. The diagram glowed on the screen, this blueprint of thinking he had spent 14 months constructing, still embedded in the bones of a platform that had grown and been modified, but had never fully shed its original skeleton. He had left this company on a Friday afternoon in late March. 5 years ago, he had not left voluntarily. He had been called into an office, not Evelyn Hayes's office, because Evelyn Hayes had not yet been CEO, and told that an internal security audit had flagged his credentials in connection with a data extraction event. The evidence, as it had been laid out, was specific and internally consistent, and completely fabricated. He had known that. The outgoing CTO, who had his own reasons for wanting the audit to land on someone expendable, had known it too. He had not fought it. Mia had been 14 months old, and the only person he had, her mother, had died in a car accident 4 months after Mia's birth, a fact that Lucas held in a sealed chamber of himself that he did not open anywhere he needed to function. He had looked at the man across the desk and done a rapid calculation. Fight this. Spend months in legal proceedings, expose his daughter to the instability of a protracted public dispute, or take the quiet exit being offered and rebuild somewhere else. He had taken the quiet exit. He had spent the next 5 years doing exactly what he said he would. Rebuilding. Taking contract work. Writing freelance code under a different business name. Keeping his head down. Building a life for Mia that was small but stable carefully. Deliberately small. He had not returned to the industry he had come from. He had told himself this was a practical decision. He had not fully examined whether it was also a punishment he was administering to himself. Now he stood in a conference room staring at his own initials in a code comment on a diagram. No one else could read the way he could, and he felt the sealed chamber in himself develop a hairline fracture. The current crisis, he understood now, having seen the monitoring data in server room B, was not random. The anomalous behavior that had the Hayes tech team in rotating states of panic was the result of a modification someone had made to the security handshake layer 18 months ago. Whoever made that modification had not understood what they were touching. They had patched a surface symptom, and in doing so introduced a structural error. A logic conflict buried deep in the routing hierarchy that had been degrading silently ever since. The system was not failing because it was old. It was failing because someone had reached into a mechanism they didn't understand and turned something the wrong direction, and then walked away. He could see the exact line where it had gone wrong. He could also see that if the error propagated to the primary sync layer, which at the current degradation rate would happen within 18 to 24 hours, the platform would not just malfunction, it would collapse. 32 enterprise clients would lose access to their data simultaneously. The liability exposure would be catastrophic. He folded the knowledge up carefully and put it somewhere inside himself. He walked back downstairs and sat in his chair near the wall. By noon, the 14th floor of Hayes Technology Group was no longer functioning at its normal register. The calm, curated professionalism that governed the space on ordinary days, the measured exchanges, the quietly humming open-plan workspace, the sense that everything was under a competent hand, had given way to something more fragmented. There were too many people moving between too many rooms. Voices that were normally modulated had developed edges. The data had started coming in from clients. 3 new escalation calls before 10. 2 contract representatives had sent formal notices requesting a meeting within 48 hours. A 4th client, one of their largest, a logistics firm with 17,000 endpoints on the Hayes platform, had sent a terse 2-paragraph message flagging that their internal team was observing data synchronization failures and requesting an immediate technical briefing. Ryan Mitchell was in emergency mode, which for Ryan looked a great deal like his normal mode, but with more visible perspiration. He had assembled the senior engineering team in the large conference room on 14 and was leading what he called a root cause analysis. He had diagrams on 3 whiteboards. He had logs spread across the table. He had a theory. He always had a theory which involved a server room ventilation failure causing hardware-level thermal errors. It was the kind of conclusion that, if accurate, would require expensive hardware replacement rather than a software audit. A software audit would require explaining decisions that Ryan had made 18 months ago. Lucas, sitting in the corridor with his contractor badge and his paper log forms, watched through the glass wall as Ryan drew arrows with increasing conviction toward a conclusion that was wrong. He watched two junior engineers exchange a glance, the kind of glance that meant they were not entirely convinced, but were not prepared to say so aloud. He watched Evelyn Hayes stand at the head of the room with her arms crossed, not looking at the whiteboards but at the data on her tablet, her expression revealing nothing except the particular stillness of someone doing difficult arithmetic. At 12:40, a board member named Gerald Marsh arrived with two others. Gerald Marsh was 61 years old, the kind of man who had made his money before people like Evelyn Hayes had been invited to the table. He walked through the space like a man performing an inspection, and he had the kind of voice that carries without effort. He took one look at the whiteboards and said, flatly, "That's not the problem." Ryan turned around. "Gerald, the analysis isn't complete. It's been incomplete for 6 days." Gerald looked at Evelyn. "I need a status briefing in 1 hour. If this isn't resolved by end of business tomorrow, we're convening an emergency board session." Evelyn met his gaze without flinching. 1 hour, she said. The room exhaled in the wrong direction. What happened next was quieter and worse. In the time between Gerald Marsh's arrival and the emergency briefing, 2 more clients filed complaints. The system's internal monitoring began throwing alerts on the secondary sink layer, the layer beneath the one that had been showing problems, the one that was, in the architecture Lucas had built, the last line of stability before a cascade failure. Ryan, increasingly desperate, had begun suggesting that the low-level contractors might have disturbed something during the physical checks in server room B. An assistant came to find Lucas in the hallway and told him, in the carefully neutral tone of someone delivering an uncomfortable message, that the director of engineering wanted him to remain on site, but step away from the engineering floor. There was a small waiting area on 12, near the vending machines. Lucas stood up without argument. He picked up his bag. He was almost at the elevator when he heard, from down the hall, the particular sharp alert tone of the routing layer, crossing a critical threshold, a sound he hadn't heard in 5 years, but recognized before he had consciously identified it. He stopped. He did not turn around immediately. He stood with his back to the floor, and his hand resting on the strap of his bag. And he did the arithmetic one more time. 12 to 14 hours, at most. He stepped into the elevator. He went to 12, sat near the vending machines, and waited. The emergency briefing at 2 o'clock became, by 3, an emergency board session. Gerald Marsh had not waited for end of business. He had called the other board members before the 1-hour briefing concluded, and by the time Evelyn Hayes stood at the head of the glass-walled conference room on the top floor, 7 people were arrayed against her at the table, her directors, her board members, and Ryan Mitchell, who had positioned himself at the corner nearest the door. The room was not going well. Ryan had presented his ventilation theory and had it dismantled in less than 4 minutes by a board member who had a background in hardware systems and was not inclined to be diplomatic. The conversation had turned, as these conversations always turn when no one has a real answer, to accountability. Who had been responsible for the maintenance cycle? What had been approved and when? The implicit pressure was aimed at Evelyn, and everyone in the room knew it. She stood her ground with the composure of someone who had spent a decade building the muscles required to do so. But beneath the surface and the slight tightening at the base of her jaw, the almost imperceptible shift in her breathing, there was something that was not composure at all. She was not frightened of losing the argument. She was frightened of losing the company. They were different fears, and only the second one showed. And only barely. "We have identified the affected layer," she said. "We are isolating the fault point now." "You don't know where the fault is," Gerald said. It was not a question. A beat. "We have it narrowed. You don't know where the fault is." The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds, and then the door opened. It opened the way doors open when someone on the other side has not knocked, and the room's attention swung toward it with the coordinated sharpness of people accustomed to controlling who enters and when. Noah Hayes stood in the doorway. He was wearing a navy sweater and dark pants, his dark hair slightly disheveled on the left side, the way it always was by mid-afternoon. His eyes were red-rimmed, the way they got when he had been crying quietly for a while rather than all at once. He had gotten past the reception desk because he had been dropped by his after-school program on the lobby level and told the receptionist his mother was expecting him, which was technically true on most days but not today. He stood in the doorway of the top-floor boardroom and looked at the assembled directors and board members with an expression of complete indifference to their importance, and then he looked at the man who had been summoned from the floor below. Lucas had been called upstairs 2 minutes earlier. Ryan had told the assistant to bring back anyone with technical credentials, including the temp, because the secondary sync layer alert had just escalated to critical. He had been standing near the window, his contractor badge still on, his bag at his feet. Noah Hayes looked at him, and everything that was contained in that look, the recognition, the relief, the question that had been sitting in a 6-year-old's chest for 2 years without anywhere to go, came out in 6 words. "Why didn't you come back?" The room went silent, not the professional silence of people pausing to assess a situation. Something deeper. The kind of silence that happens when a room of adults suddenly understands that whatever they were arguing about has been made, by 4 seconds and 6 words, completely beside the point. Gerald Marsh, who had not stopped talking since 3 o'clock, had nothing to say. Ryan Mitchell was looking at Lucas, with the expression of a man rapidly revising his assumptions about who was in the room with him. Evelyn Hayes had not moved. She was standing at the head of the table where she had been standing since the meeting began, and she was looking at her son, and then at Lucas Carter, and then at her son again. The composure she had maintained for the past 4 hours, the composure she had maintained, in truth, for most of the past 2 years was still present in the surface of her face but absent from her eyes. Her eyes had the look of someone who has just stepped off a curb they didn't know was there. Lucas crossed the room. He crouched down to Noah's level. He looked at the boy at the dark hair and the careful eyes, and the slight tremor at the corners of his mouth that meant he was holding something very large in a very small space, and then he said, quietly enough that only Noah could hear, "I'm here now." Noah put both arms around Lucas's neck and pressed his face into his shoulder, and stayed there. The boardroom held its breath. Evelyn Hayes looked at the two of them. She pressed her lips together once. Then she looked at the table and at the data on her tablet. And she made a decision that she had not known, until that moment, she was capable of making. She looked at Lucas. "Can you help us?" she asked. The question hung in the room for a moment, just a moment before Lucas set it aside. He stood, carefully. Noah's hand found his and held it. The boy did not let go, and Lucas did not pull away. The board members watched with the alert, slightly disconnected attention of people observing something they don't have a category for. "You should probably know," Lucas said, looking at Evelyn, "that I built the original system." The silence that followed had a different quality than the one before. Gerald Marsh said, "I beg your pardon?" "The routing architecture on your current platform. The security layer. The node structure." Lucas glanced at Ryan. "The thing you've been trying to diagnose for 6 days. I wrote it. 5 years ago." Ryan's face moved through several expressions in quick succession, landing on something resembling defensive calculation. "Then you should have disclosed that when you were brought in," Ryan said. "To whom?" Lucas asked. It was a simple question, not an accusatory one, and it landed worse for that. There was, in the next minute, a rapid and unspoken realignment in the room. Gerald Marsh was looking at Evelyn. Evelyn was not looking at Gerald Marsh. The junior board members were doing the mental arithmetic of how a company brings in a temp who built their core infrastructure without recognizing him, and arriving at an answer that reflected poorly on everyone. Evelyn spoke. "You were let go 5 years ago," she said. Her voice was level, careful. "Yes, under the Carver audit." Lucas didn't answer immediately. He looked at her in the way of someone who is deciding how much of a true thing to say. Then, under the Carver audit, she held his gaze. Something moved behind her eyes' recognition, and beneath the recognition, something that resembled the early stages of a reckoning. The Carver audit had been conducted by an external firm hired by the outgoing CTO. The report had named Lucas Carter as the source of a data extraction event. Evelyn Hayes had inherited that report when she took the CEO role 2 years later, had reviewed it, and had made a decision not to revisit it, not to question it, but to accept it as established history and move forward. She had been 26, newly promoted, managing more crises than she could count. She had told herself that was why she had not looked more closely. She had not, until this moment, seriously examined whether a fire she had failed to investigate was one she had helped allow to keep burning. Noah was still holding Lucas's hand. He had pressed close to Lucas's side in the way children do when a space feels threatening, using the safe person as a kind of anchor. Evelyn watched her son do this with the particular attentiveness of a mother who has been watching her child search for exactly this kind of anchoring for 2 years and failing to find it. 2 years ago, Lucas Carter had been contracted through a different agency to help with a data migration project at a firm 3 blocks from the Hayes building. His daughter Mia and Noah Hayes had ended up at the same park one Saturday afternoon through a collision of neighborhood geography and coincidence, and within 40 minutes of each other's company, Noah's careful silences and Mia's bright, insistent friendliness, the children had become something close to friends. Lucas and Evelyn had met at the park bench. He had not known who she was. She had introduced herself as Evelyn, with the ease of someone briefly and gratefully anonymous. She had not known who he was either. He had come back several more Saturdays that month, sometimes with both children, sometimes with just Noah. Those afternoons teaching Noah to identify birds by their calls, building card structures on the park table, talking about nothing in the easy register of 2 people who have decided, without discussing it, to simply be comfortable, had been the first Saturdays in a long time, when Noah had been something resembling fully present. Then Lucas had looked up the company name on an invoice and understood where he was. He had not gone back to the park. He had not called. He had not explained. He had simply, quietly, ceased to be there the way he had learned. In the year his daughter's mother died, and the year a fabricated audit ended his career, that disappearing was sometimes the only thing he knew how to do cleanly. "I need you to look at the system," Evelyn said. It was not phrased as a request, exactly, but it had lost the imperious tone that characterized most of her directives. It was closer to something plainer, a statement of need, from a person who had exhausted her other options. Lucas looked at Noah. "I need to work for a few minutes," he said. "Can you sit with your mom?" Noah considered this with the gravity of a child taking a serious question seriously. Then he nodded once and released Lucas's hand and moved, without being guided, to stand near Evelyn. She looked down at her son and placed her hand on his shoulder. He didn't pull away. It was a small thing. It cost her something to feel how small a thing it was, and to accept that. Lucas walked to the monitoring terminal at the end of the conference table. Someone had pulled up a dashboard, a surface-level read of the platform's current status, the kind of view designed for executive briefings. He looked at it for approximately 10 seconds, then turned to the nearest engineer, a young woman named Andrea, who had the quiet, exhausted look of someone running on 4 hours of sleep and caffeine for 3 days. "Can you open the routing log?" Full depth. Not the summary view. Andrea looked at Ryan. Ryan's face was unreadable. After a moment, he nodded. She opened it. Lucas leaned forward. The room watched him read. He did not scroll quickly, the way people scroll when they are performing comprehension. He moved through the log with deliberate, unhurried attention. The attention of someone confirming a location rather than searching for it. He stopped. "Line 47, he said. "In the security handshake subroutine." Andrea pulled it up. The room looked at line 47 of the security handshake subroutine. Most of them saw code. The board members saw numbers and brackets. Ryan Mitchell saw a segment he recognized vaguely, with the recognition of someone who had approved a modification to that subroutine 18 months ago, without fully reading the accompanying documentation. That's the modification applied in March of last year, Lucas said. Whoever made it was trying to patch a latency issue in the authentication sequence. What they actually did was invert the priority order of the sync check and the verification handshake. He paused. The system has been running in a state of structural conflict ever since. Every query is triggering a micro-reconciliation event between the two processes. It's been degrading the primary node cluster by approximately 0.3% per week. You're at critical load now, Gerald Marsh said. In English, please. Lucas straightened slightly. Someone fixed the wrong thing the wrong way. The system has been slowly breaking itself ever since. If it isn't corrected in the next several hours, you lose the primary cluster. When that goes, you lose data integrity across all 32 client accounts simultaneously. The silence in the room was complete. Ryan Mitchell said, "That modification was approved through standard process." "I know," Lucas said. He said it without particular emphasis. He was not here to assign blame. He was here because the system was failing, and he had built the system, and there were 32 companies depending on it not failing. "Can you fix it?" Evelyn asked. "Yes." "How long?" 20 minutes. Maybe less. Ryan started to say something about access permissions, about the protocol for granting system access to non-credentialed personnel, and Gerald Marsh turned to look at him with an expression that stopped the sentence before it left Ryan's mouth. Evelyn said, "Give him access." Andrea typed for 30 seconds. A second terminal unlocked. Lucas sat down. What happened next was one of those moments people in the room would describe differently afterward. Some said it looked effortless. Others said it looked like surgery. And both descriptions would be accurate. He worked through the codebase with the efficiency of someone retracing his own steps in a familiar space. He did not narrate. He did not ask for reassurance. He made corrections in a sequence that was internally logical, but which no one else in the room could have explained as he was making them. 11 minutes after he sat down, the alert tone that had been cycling on the secondary sync layer stopped. The monitoring dashboard shifted. The load distribution across the node cluster normalized. The skewed pattern Lucas had first noticed in server room B resolving back toward the balanced distribution the system had been designed to maintain. One by one, the cascading warnings that had been building in the platform's internal logs fell quiet. Andrea was watching the readout. She said, very quietly, "It's stabilizing." The room exhaled. Gerald Marsh was looking at Lucas with an expression that had, over the past 11 minutes, traveled a considerable distance from where it had started. Ryan Mitchell was not looking at anyone. The junior board members were looking at Evelyn, who was looking at the back of Lucas's head with an expression she did not bother to control, because the composure she had been maintaining for the past 3 hours had, very quietly, run out. Lucas leaned back in the chair. He looked at the screen for a moment longer, confirming. Then he looked at Noah, who was standing next to his mother, watching him with eyes that were steady and completely attentive. Lucas gave him a small nod. Noah gave him one back. The board members filed out in a particular order, Gerald Marsh first, with a final look at Evelyn that was not an apology but was close to one, then the others in his wake. Ryan Mitchell was the last to leave, and he did so without speaking to anyone, which was its own kind of statement. Andrea stayed long enough to copy the corrected files, send the automated client notifications that the platform had been stabilized, and close her laptop. She looked at Lucas on her way out with the expression of someone who wants to say something and has decided this is not the moment. She left. The room was down to 3 people and a child. Noah had moved again, in the quiet way he had, the way you don't always notice until it's happened, back to Lucas's side. He was sitting in the chair next to him now, the one Andrea had vacated, with his knees folded under him and his hands in his lap. He was not looking at his mother. He was looking at the now steady monitoring dashboard with the focused attention of a 6-year-old who has decided that understanding things is important. Evelyn Hayes stood at the head of the table. The composure was gone. Not visibly destroyed, she had not cried, had not raised her voice, had not done any of the things people who watched her in boardrooms assumed she was incapable of. The composure was simply absent now, the way structural support becomes absent from a building that looks intact until you stand close enough to it. She said, "Why didn't you come back?" It was the same question her son had asked. Same words. Same cadence. Different weight. Lucas looked at her. He turned the question over once. The way he turned most things over before answering, not from hesitation, but from the habit of a man who has learned that words, once given, don't come back. "Because I looked you up," he said, "and I found out who you were." Evelyn said nothing. "You were my former employer. I left under a cloud. Whatever you believed about that audit, it was a cloud I couldn't explain away in a Saturday afternoon at the park." He paused. And Noah was doing well. He was opening up. "I didn't want the person helping him to turn into a complication for his mother. He stopped talking again after you left," Evelyn said. It was a flat statement, not an accusation. The flatness of it was worse than if it had been one. Lucas absorbed that. "I know I made the wrong call," he said. "I told myself I was protecting everyone. I was probably protecting myself." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Noah, who had turned from the monitoring dashboard and was looking at her with the careful, attentive eyes that always made her feel, in the most private part of herself, that her son understood her better than she understood him. "The Carver audit," she said. "You don't have to. I reviewed it when I took the CEO role," she said. "I should have reviewed it more carefully. The firm that produced it was brought in by a man who had reasons to want the audit to land on someone. I accepted the conclusions without asking the right questions. I was 26, and I had 40 other fires. And I told myself it was settled history." A pause. "I was wrong." It was, for Evelyn Hayes, a statement of extraordinary cost. Lucas recognized that. He had watched her in this room for the past several hours. He understood what it meant for her to say those words in this register. Not in prepared language, not in managed presentation, but in the stripped-down, unguarded voice of someone who has run out of management and is down to simply speaking the truth. He didn't fill the silence. Noah did. He slid down from his chair and crossed the 3 feet of space between himself and Lucas, and leaned his head against Lucas's arm. Evelyn watched her son do this. She watched the quiet, natural way Lucas shifted to accommodate the boy. The unconscious ease of a person who has spent 6 years being someone's entire anchor, and something in her chest that had been held at structural tension for a very long time released slightly. "He talks about you," she said. "Even when he doesn't mention you by name, there's a version of him when he's describing something he loved, a way of being comfortable that I could never quite place." She paused. "Now I can." Lucas looked at Noah, who was looking at the steady dashboard. "All the warnings gone." "He's a good kid," Lucas said. "Yes," Evelyn said. "He is." By the time the last notification had gone out to Hayes Technologies' 32 clients, and the secondary diagnostic had run clean, it was past 5 in the evening. The 14th floor had emptied with the efficient speed of people who have been running on adrenaline and have now run out of it. Chairs pushed back. Laptops closed. The particular hush of a space transitioning from crisis to aftermath. Gerald Marsh issued a statement, brief, formal, routed through the communications team acknowledging that the platform issue had been resolved and that a full technical review was forthcoming. He did not mention Lucas Carter by name. He did not need to. The 11 people who had been in the boardroom when Lucas sat down at that terminal had drawn their own conclusions, and those conclusions would move through the organization with the speed of things that nobody announces but everybody knows. Ryan Mitchell submitted a request to leave early for a personal appointment and was not seen again that day. No one stopped him. No one had to. The formal consequences would come. There was no scenario in which they didn't, given the scale of the crisis and the paper trail of the approved modification and the 18 months of degradation that had followed it. But they would arrive through proper channels, and they would not require any additional effort from anyone remaining in this room. Andrea, who had been with the engineering team for 2 years, and had spent a significant portion of that time, quietly aware that something about Ryan's approach to legacy documentation was wrong, without feeling confident enough to say so, sent Lucas a message before she left. "I'm sorry it took this long for anyone to check the work properly." She left that one. Evelyn Hayes called a brief gathering of her remaining senior staff, the people she trusted, not the full room, and told them she would be conducting a full historical audit of the Carver report and the events surrounding Lucas Carter's departure from the company 5 years ago. She said it in the same voice she used for everything in professional contexts even. Measured, but the people who knew her well heard something different in it. Not uncertainty, something closer to resolution. She asked Lucas to stay while the others cleared out. He stayed. He sat in the quieted boardroom while she made 2 calls, spoke briefly with the communications team, and delegated the final confirmations for the client notifications. He did not feel impatient. He had Mia's sitter until 7. There was time. When she was done, she sat down across from him. Not at the head of the table. Across from him, in the way of 2 people of equivalent standing, having a conversation. "I want to offer you your position back," she said. "Your original role or a version of it that reflects what you actually built here, with proper acknowledgement, full retroactive clearance on the Carver matter, and appropriate compensation." Lucas looked at his hands on the table, looked at them for a moment. "I need to think about it," he said. "Of course." There was a pause that was not uncomfortable. "Your daughter," Evelyn said. "Mia. Noah talks about her. She's good," Lucas said. "She's very loud." Something moved across Evelyn's face that was close to a smile, not the careful professional expression she deployed in meetings, but something briefer and more genuine that came and went before it could be categorized. "Noah's not loud," she said. "No," Lucas agreed. "He's not." Another pause. "They should see each other," Evelyn said. It was stated plainly, without the corporate hedging she used for everything that mattered to her. Lucas looked at her. He held her gaze for a moment that lasted slightly longer than professional convention required. "Yes," he said. "They should." Lucas Carter drove home at 6:47. The sedan's transmission shudder was slightly more pronounced than it had been that morning, but he did not think about the transmission. He drove the familiar route through the gray November streets, past the grocery with the sign that had been missing a letter for 3 months, past the park where 2 children had built card structures on a table 18 months ago, past the corner where the streetlight had been out for 2 weeks, and was still out. Mia was waiting in the front room with the babysitter, who was studying for her undergraduate exams on the couch, and looked up with the expression of someone who had been counting minutes. Mia herself was constructing something on the floor, an elaborate structure of small wooden blocks that appeared to be, based on the concentration applied to it, of enormous architectural importance. She looked up when the door opened. "You're late," she said. Not a complaint. An observation, delivered with the same steady matter-of-factness with which she approached most things, a quality she had developed early, and that her father recognized because it was the quality he had spent years trying to cultivate, and she had simply arrived with. "I am," he said. "Sorry, Bug." She stood up, accepted his hug with the brief, complete presence of a child who does this without ceremony, then returned to her architectural project. He paid the sitter, made them both dinner pasta with the jarred sauce that Mia preferred, which he supplemented with spinach, in a process she was aware of, but had agreed to permit, and sat with her while she told him about the disagreement in her class that afternoon, over which color was technically the most versatile. He listened. He laughed twice. He refilled her glass. After she went to sleep, he sat at the kitchen table for a long time. He thought about Evelyn's offer and his answer. "I need to think about it." He had meant it. He was not the kind of man who said he needed to think about things when he had already decided, and he was not the kind of man who made decisions based on the shape of a moment, however significant. He had learned, in 5 years of careful, small, deliberate living, that moments which feel like turning points sometimes are, and sometimes they are only the feeling of possibility, which is different. He thought about the routing architecture, and the way it had felt to sit down at that terminal and move through the codebase the way you move through a space you built yourself, with the particular authority of authorship, the specific satisfaction of knowing not just where the walls are but why you put them there. He thought about the 14 months he had spent building that system and how completely he had closed the door on it, and whether the closing had been protection or waste or something that had never needed to be either. He thought about Noah, holding his hand in a room full of people who had no category for what that meant. He thought about Evelyn Hayes saying, across a table and not at the head of it, they should see each other. The plainness of it. The absence of performance. He made no decision that night, but in the morning, he dressed in the cleanest of his 4 dress shirts, the one with no fraying at the collar, and he dropped Mia at school with her lunch packed and her curls contained. He drove not to the temp agency but directly to Hayes Technology Group. He told the lobby receptionist his name. The receptionist looked at her screen, and something shifted in her expression, and she reached for a badge. It was blue. Lucas accepted it. He clipped it to his shirt and walked toward the elevator, and for the first time in 5 years, he did not make himself small. Somewhere across town, a boy with careful eyes was being dropped at school, carrying something lighter than he had carried the day before. And in a corner office on the top floor, a woman stood at her window and watched the morning arrive, and did not feel entirely alone in it.